So Patrick, what was the Biennial like? Tell us about the Chicago Architecture Biennial.
So the Chicago Architecture Biennial is a serious problem.
Why is that?
For architecture, because it comes along as the first Chicago Architecture Biennale where we would expect architecture and contemporary architecture to be represented. And there is really very, very little, if anything, of what I consider to be relevant contemporary architecture in that show.
What did you see in that show that triggered this?
Well, I don't see architecture. And
is it art?
Well, what we're looking at there is an engagement with poverty, underdevelopment. If it was ungenerous, I would say a voyeuristic engagement with such phenomenon, but I think it's also partly genuine, or might be genuine. And but I consider an architectural biennial should be concerned with the technological and societal frontier of the built environments, in looking how we can, what's the next step for contemporary civilization in respect to its architectural and urban physiognomy and development, and far less the task of a biennial to help development along in arenas which still have to catch up various steps which are laid out already. So here there's a desire to do good, feel good, but the real task is missed out on. It's a bit like sending top cancer researchers into African spaces to hand out antibiotics. That's a misuse of resources.
Okay. So what do you think that next step of societal architecture development is for these poor countries?
Well, I believe that there has evolved and matured a compelling global best practice paradigm for architecture, which I call parametricism. It's been evolving for over 15 to perhaps even 20 years. It's architecture's answer to the computationally empowered civilization. It's itself computationally empowered and fits to our contemporary challenges and opportunities of post-Fordist network society. And these new methodologies and repertoires and values are universally applicable, so they would also be the ones to use and utilize for the less developed arenas, ideally, although there it might be more immediate relief to just catch up with given standards. But if one wanted to innovate there, it would be along parametricism's lines. And we also engage with less developed and less well-resourced domains and milieux. Social housing needs to be taken up by parametricism if it is to be brought and allowed to be participating in the contemporary intelligence the discipline has to offer. So the problem is here that the curators and protagonists of this Biennale don't see that, in fact misunderstand what has evolved in the last years as a kind of misguided exuberance. They look at costs without looking at the advantage and achievement which these cost investments deliver, and they don't understand either that on the cost side of things, this paradigm promises cost efficiencies as well as performance efficiencies, which are unavailable to those who think that the modernist repertoire is an eternal and unquestionable repertoire.
Do you think this biennial is unique in this direction that it's taking?
Absolutely not. It's unfortunately in trend with the Venice Biennale, with architectural prizes, with architectural critics who foreground more and more kind of moralizing and politicizing agenda. This is the aftermath and fallout of the 2008 financial crisis leading to the Great Recession, leading into the European debt crisis, with political repercussions in the Occupy movement, Arab Spring, and many other things. So I understand, I can rationalize how this has emerged and why there is an urgency of repoliticizing all domains of society. including architecture. And I myself have been repoliticized, but my agenda is not going back to the 70s. So I'm disagreeing with the curators and the general trend of the discourse of architecture on two counts. A, I'm disagreeing with the underlying politics, which I think is regressive ultimately. So to offer progressiveness of 40, 50 years ago is regressive in 2015. So strong political differences. But beyond that, I also have to say that we have to defend a space for architectural discourse. We can't allow that to be swarmed by political agendas. These political agendas should be discussed in the political arena, and we need to recognize what the real political trends have been, where we've moved, and this can't all be negative. I believe in the heuristics of the rational, of the real, and we have to understand what architecture can offer to the contemporary political constitution of world society and its resources and ideologies, and discuss best practice in that context. Now on top of that, I have ideas about where politics should be moving, could be moving, and I think my thinking is more in line with the real tendencies. It's predictive and has to be predictive in terms of an architectural project, because we want to align our innovation strategies where reality is moving, and not with kind of delusional pipe dreams of where we might want it to move. Now I have my own, as I said, political agendas, which I discuss not so much within architecture, but in political arenas, with activists, with other debates, like the Battle of Ideas, for instance, coming up in London, where I'll be discussing libertarian economics and political philosophy amongst political and activists, philosophers, economists, sociologists, and that's the right audience for a political debate. Architects can participate in this, but what makes little sense is to think that one can win political argument in an architectural audience which will not be prepared for that, will be easy prey, and that's happening all too much now in architectural academia, and I find that highly problematic.
One last question. What would a biennial of your curation look like? What would it be like? Well,
I've thought about this a number of times. Of course, it has to be rather inclusive. I would think it should be constructed as a competitive battle of stylistic approaches. They need to be present, and I would use kind of Google search statistics to filter out where relative space allocations should be. I think Biennale should be rather inclusive. It's not the space for being an absolute inclusive show. I do that as well. I have a project with the London Design Museum for an exclusively parametricism show involving all the design disciplines under that banner. But a Biennale should bring everybody on board, everybody in. The criteria would be architecture, not art, not politics, but all directions and being represented according to the cachet they perhaps have. Maybe within that there will be a subsection where I would allow for the curator's statement to be more trenchant, but otherwise it should be a big get-together of all designing and working architects.
Patrick Schumacher, thank you very much.
My pleasure.